This week, Emmet and I begin a series on the various biographies of Stan Lee, starting with Jordan Raphael and Tom Spurgeon's Stan Lee and the Rise and Fall of the American Comic Book. And I talk with the book's co-author, Jordan Raphael, about his collaboration on this book with our late friend Tom Spurgeon. But first, if you're enjoying this podcast, support the show at patreon.com/deconcomics for as little as $2 a month. With your pledge of at least $4 a month, you can access hours of bonus commercial-free podcasts. And if you give at the $10 level, you can review the book of your choice with me on the podcast. Pledge your support now at patreon.com/deconcomics. This is Tim.
This is Emmet.
And this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo with Emmet out among the kangaroos in Australia. How are you doing?
I'm very well, Tim. Thank you.
So, recently we were making an episode of our Patreon show, Spider-Man 1963. We were talking about issue 20, and we hit on the idea of going through the various biographies of Stan Lee. Because
why did we say that?
Well, I just maybe something to do, and there are a lot of them out there. I found 8 just looking around on Amazon, and people might wonder which one should I read? So, and most of these are fairly recent books, but we decided to start with what I think is the oldest one on the list from 2003. Stan Lee and the Rise and Fall of the American Comic Book by Jordan Raphael and the late, great Tom Spurgeon, who, of course, used to be on our show quite frequently. So, and not only is it the oldest one, I think I felt like we should start with this because it might be the most even-handed, was kind of my impression. Do you think, and you've read one of the other ones, do you feel like this was an even-handed book?
Yes, the other one you mentioned is the recent book by Abraham Reisman, and I'll keep my powder dry on my thoughts on that book for now. I liked what Spurgeon and Raphael did here because I feel there was a degree of criticism, but at the same time there was an objectivity to it. There was no... we're being invited to review the facts as far as they knew them at that time. Yeah. And some of the later biographies that you mentioned, events have caught up with Stan Lee to some degree in the public arena. But there was a lot of material which was known to people who were comic book fans or who hung out in the early internet, when word started spreading a little more rapidly about the treatment of Ditko and Kirby and what happened to Steve Gerber, what happened to Neil Adams. All these people's stories started to percolate a little more outside of very limited fan cultures within the States. Mm-hmm. And I think we have to credit people like, apologies to Kumar here, here's your one per episode. I think we have to credit people like Alan Moore as well for raising the standard for Kirby during the 80s, and particularly with his 1963 project and his ABC line, getting a few digs in at Stan Lee and raising Kirby's concepts a bit more. This idea of mistreatment and advantage being taken, and the profits clearly that were not being directed to some of the co-creators. Mm-hmm. Spurgeon sort of touches on all of this stuff, and he just presents the facts. And if you're familiar with his writing from the Comics Journal, he always had this very fair approach. I admired Spurgeon a lot. I very briefly interacted with him, I think, a couple of years ago on social media, but I never spoke to him like you did. You had actually had a relationship with him. Mm-hmm. But I always saw him as somebody who was very knowledgeable about the history of comics and who wanted to impart that knowledge to others. That's the important bit. Mm-hmm. It wasn't showing off, wasn't being a know-it-all, it wasn't being a gatekeeper. It was here's the information, as far as I can tell. Here's my sources for that information. Do with it what you will, and I think that's kind of what this book also does with the life of Stan Lee.
Yeah, well, and sidebar, I mean, if you listen to our kind of remembrance episode of Tom after he passed away, I mean, the people that I had on were talking about how he was so focused on, comics and writing information about comics and getting, he didn't take care of his health very well. He wasn't really into romance, dating or anything. He just wanted to read comics and write about comics and talk with comics people, and and that was his singular focus. So, yeah, it's not surprising that he would be one of the first to do a book about him.
Yeah,
about Stan Lee.
And I think we should get into the book in a moment, but there's something you raised while we were messaging back and forth about this book. You recognized that one of the colleges Lee attended for his sort of promotional events was your college. You have to tell me which one was it, because I highlighted all the colleges mentioned in the book.
Right, so on page 157, it opens talking about Stan's itinerary for a weekend lecture tour in the early 70s. It doesn't tell the exact year. But it talks about him going to Augustana College, which is in Rock Island, Illinois. The airport is in Moline. It mentions Moline. It doesn't mention Rock Island. But he went there and spoke at Centennial Hall, which is a building I'm quite familiar with. So, this was, maybe a little more than 10 years before I was a student there. So I completely missed out on this. I was probably in first or second grade when this happened. But yeah, I was surprised to find that out. If it had happened a decade later, I would have probably been right there to see him.
Yeah, and that's what's interesting as well. This idea which emerges through Spurgeon's book of Lee really being focused on being a brand ambassador. I think it's the most generous way I could put it, but I think a celebrity personality is maybe more accurate. And I wasn't aware. I mean, maybe I knew, but I hadn't fully become aware just how much of his career was focused solely on that.
On being famous.
On being famous.
Yeah.
And it's funny because maybe the germ of the idea for this conversation that we're having right now is, as you say, during the Spider-Man 1963 episodes, we keep pointing out, why is he talking about celebrity so much? Why is Spider-Man talking about the Beatles all of a sudden? Why is
and plots revolving around making movies,
making money. But being famous is, I think, trumps making money. Being famous is the goal.
Right.
And Spider-Man struggles with that, and then the struggle internally within the book between Ditko and Lee as to what's actually happening on the page.
And he had in mind that he was going to be writing screenplays and novels and stuff, and so he doesn't use his real name in the comics. He goes by Stan Lee rather than Stanley Lieber, because he wants to save his real name for when he's doing more highly regarded art forms like screenplays and novels. And so that was always his focus. He was going to be famous for that. But then later on, it seems like when he gets a chance to do that kind of thing, he just can't do it. He's got so many little ideas, but he can't, it's so hard for him to focus on one thing for a long time. Yeah. There's that one point where some director is guiding him through writing a screenplay, which is sold but never made. But other than that, it's always just, he would rather just write an outline and have somebody else do the rest of the work.
Yeah. Well, one of my favorites was, I think, was it the director, Alan Rene? I think it was.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. But one of my favorites in terms of Stan Lee's ideas for a movie or a novel or whatever it was, creative notions, was the mob takes over the government. Now crime is their problem. And I was like, what? There is something something unformed about his creative impulse. Like
Hmm.
by all accounts, and I think we can take this as an accurate reflection of his professional abilities. He was a very good editor
Hmm.
because what he would do was he would zero in on the action beats and the character beats that would make a page work. But he's reviewing somebody else's work, so I think he was actually, and he was trained as being an editor.
Hmm.
He wanted to be a writer, he wanted to be a creator, but he was his training and his background was in editing and shepherding a creative team through to publication, right?
Hmm.
So, by all accounts, he understood what made a story work, and maybe more so than in a lot of other folks in a lot of his contemporaries, he understood what made a comic book story work at that time. And we're talking about a narrow band of time.
Hmm.
1950s, 1960s, maybe 1970s. I think the form has evolved at that point already. So he has that skill set, but I don't know if he has, as you say, the ability to go from notion to actual developed plot narrative story. Um, so yeah, I found that fascinating, and the fact that he continually insists on being credited as a writer and co-creator and somebody who works with the likes of Kirby and Ditko, and then the debate always has been how much of the story were they introducing and how much was he taking credit for on the basis of Marvel method.
Yeah, I feel like this book is, uh, like I said, even-handed about pointing out what Stan was really good at and
Mm-hmm.
the ways that he really did contribute to the creation of all those characters, and how one of the key things was that even after he'd been working in comics for 2 decades before he finally kind of hits on the idea of not just making the artists follow some of what they're doing at other publishers, but kind of setting them free to be creative. Ditko and Kirby, and that's when things really get going, and they become the leader rather than the follower in terms of
Yes.
comics content.
Yes, I found it interesting. The book mentions Kirby wanting to redevelop his science heroes idea, this notion of sort of adventurers in this sort of science fiction genre space. And he wanted to work on that kind of like updating his challengers with the unknown type era. And immediately light bulb over my head because I was going, oh yes, this was what Alan Moore did with in the ABC line, like Top Ten and Tom Strong and Promethea. There was mention of science heroes. They were called science heroes, not superheroes.
Hmm.
Uh, and again, I thought that was another sort of tip of the hat to Kirby. And Lee insists that the Marvel Revolution was inspired by, in some tellings, his wife Joan encouraging him to pursue his dream, and then he's sort of gazing out the window, and he's like, "Oh well, Marvel superheroes are the superheroes you see outside your window. It's the ordinary world we live in, but with superheroes." So that sort of grit of normality, inspiring the fantasy, and then you got Kirby with his science heroes concept, and it's like, no, that was already in train, that was already happening,
Hmm.
And then again, I think Spurgeon sort of tips a hat as well to Gardner Fox and Carmen Infantino over in DC for doing something similar as well, and like before the Marvel Revolution. This
Hmm.
idea of more character-based superheroics, less monolithic
Hmm.
than we tend to assume DC was, and they don't get. Like, Lee is such a good sort of self-marketer.
Hmm.
He takes the credit for all of that. This cultural moment that's happening within comics that is naturally evolving. I think a lot of different people coming to the same sort of conclusion. Let's invest more character detail into these stories. Let's have more of a focus on ordinary lives. And Lee's like, nope, that was me. I did all of that.
And another contribution that they point to on 122, it says no editor in comic book history did a better job at communicating a house style without losing the creative elements made the line stand out in the first place. So yeah, I think he was good at that, but where the problems come in are kind of, if he's taking credit for too much and
being
why did he do
financially
that?
rewarded for it too. Like, like he's making bank off of the work of these other people, and the fact that Ditko became such an objectivist Randian. Can we credit Stan Lee for Ditko's philosophical turn to wait? I must earn from the sweat of my own brow.
Well, what I got from the book was that Ditko was like that when he was doing
already.
Spider-Man. It's just that it wasn't so strongly in his comics yet.
Yes,
but apparently
yes.
he was already a Randian.
Yes, he was already subscribing to this idea. And another note that Spurgeon makes that I find quite telling was that Ditko was one of the first fan creators. And you've got these working creatives like Kirby and Lee and the folks who came along with their stable creators that they tried to bring with them, who are just, it's a gig, right? Mm-hmm. They're just telling stories. They're trying to follow trends, like what's popular in movies, what's popular in the world, what kind of events can we sort of reinterpret into comic book space. And then Ditko's coming in and he's seeing all these things as tropes. He's subscribed to the genre. He understands superheroics as something that exists as superheroics, not a melange of different sources of influence.
Mm-hmm.
I found that very interesting. I always associated the fan creators with the Roy Thomas era. The people who grew up with the Lee persona and the bullpen idea and the first wave of books like Fantastic Four and Spider-Man and Thor and all the rest of it. And then they're like, oh, I want to be part of this. And they started codifying the Marvel superhero idea. Whereas Ditko he's already there. He's already got it. He's got the gist.
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of informs his style. And when we're talking about Stan Lee as an editor, one of the things I've heard for many, many years was that part of Kirby's frustrations was not only that he wasn't getting full credit and he wasn't getting fully paid, although the stand he took on Joe Simon's ownership of Captain America was that upset me a bit actually to read that that he sided with Marvel, but he needed money. One of the things I find interesting is that all these guys, I've lost my train of thought. Sorry. Ditko was okay. I found it again. So Kirby was not only producing all this work, his style was being taken by Lee as the house style. He's like, draw like Kirby, make comics like Kirby. His emphasis on physicality, his emphasis on motion. All these other artists had to sort of mimic that, but not Ditko, because Ditko had his own style entirely.
Mm-hmm.
And as we've touched on already, part of the pleasure of us doing this Spider-Man podcast is me just coming to these books for the first time in a long time, going, actually, this is really good. Like, there's a lot of really good stuff in here. How he lays out action as well is quite strange and odd and a bit random at times, but I like it a lot. And I am curious that he was given leeway, as opposed to the other folks being asked to follow and train with Kirby. Stan Lee understood that Ditko was doing something, and maybe that's what we're talking about there. He knows when to be hands off because he understands the value of the commercial proposition of this particular creator, but he can't leave well enough alone. And the fact that the relationship between them broke down is so interesting, because what I take from this is that he basically killed the golden goose. He had to keep inserting what he felt was more palatable storytelling into these narratives of Ditko's. Like, make it softer, make Peter Parker less maybe actually having some political agency. Like, he actually has values, and Stanley's like, no. Like, he makes him a bit of a jerk, as we've talked about. But like,
yes. Yeah, well, and as this book points out, practically as soon as Romita starts drawing Peter Parker, he becomes a more appealing character, and maybe we don't think of him as being that kind of, always ready for a fight kind of a-hole character, but in the Ditko version, he is.
Well, actually, this is what I'm trying to get at. We assume it's always Ditko, and I think it is mostly Ditko doing the creative work in it. But a lot of that stuff is the internal voice. That the comments on Flash, the resentment of Flash's success with women and with and his popularity, and the eagerness to get into the fight, typically is quite reactionary. And I'm wondering if that actually is Lee, and that is an example of Lee's genuine feelings of insecurity, of desire for more, of this sort of engine that propelled him through his public life. Needing to be famous, needing to be known, needing to be respected. His professed contempt for comic books because comics are a lesser form of art. He wants to be a novelist. He wants to be a screenwriter. He wishes he'd gone to Hollywood News in his 30s or in his 20s so he could have become famous and successful, and like Paddy Chayefsky, who he went to school with, which blew my mind. Never mind Bill Finger. Never mind.
Well, yeah, they all went to the same high school, although maybe not at the same time, but yeah, that
James
high school.
Baldwin, the guy who directed Willy Wonka. They're all there in the same school. I might be wrong. I think the Willy Wonka one's actually a relative of Stanley's. That's sorry, correction.
Okay, but yeah, James Baldwin went there, and yeah, I think both Bob Kane and Bill Finger went to that same high school.
Amazing. Never knew that. Incredible.
So yeah, some interesting things in the history that I hadn't been aware of. I mean, they talk about this artist Joe Maneely.
Oh, I'm glad you brought him up. Yeah,
because I guess he and Stan, Stan was not usually very, like really social with the artist, but he got along very well with Maneely. And if Maneely ends up getting hit by a commuter train and dying when he's 32 years old in 1958, and it sounds like if that hadn't happened, things could have been very different. Romita wonders if Maneely would have gotten all the Marvel work in the 60s because he was a very fast artist. But Stan himself says, I think if he hadn't died, I would have eventually maybe quit Marvel and gone off with Joe and done other stuff. So, it may not have happened at all. There might be no Spider-Man and no Avengers and no Fantastic Four. But either way, things would have been... we would have been having a different conversation here, or maybe no conversation at all.
It's interesting, isn't it? Like this is after Maneely has died, and Stan Lee is saying, "Oh, I would have continued to working with him, and we would have gone off and done our own thing." Like even from this point, he just wants to get out. He just wants out. He wants to do something else. He wants to do something more prestigious.
Yeah, that could very well be just his fantasy, and maybe he would not have, but.
Yeah, now Maneely has turned into a fetish object in terms of like the potential life he could have had creatively with Joe Maneely. Is this fantasy story now? And I found that very, very peculiar when I was read it. I was like, why do you assume? And again, implicit is that, he would say, working with him, but implicit, the relationship was that Maneely did all of this work for him, and did it very fast and very well. So Lee's looking at him as a resource, right? And then extrapolating from that, well, had he not died, I would have become more famous.
So it could be just Stan's excuse to himself of why it never happened because Joe died. So if not for that, I could have gone on to do something more prestigious and maybe be famous like I wanted to be.
Yeah, and. Can I read you a passage from the book?
Sure.
Okay, so I'm not meaning to chop and change so much, but an event occurs later on in the history of Marvel where Stan and his cousin's sister's husband. Like the familial connection between Stan Lee and Martin Goodman is very interesting. But Stan Lee got this gig.
A cousin-in-law, I think he's called at one point.
So through Martin Goodman, Stan Lee got his break. Martin took care of Stan Lee. I think there was, again, there's a lot of manipulation there. Stan Lee doesn't speak of him particularly fondly, certainly after he died. But there's this sense of Lee being carried along by Martin Goodman because he recognizes that Lee is again, a resource, right? It's the same relationship that Lee then, I might say, inflicts on some of his creative partnerships, inverted commas, if you please. Anyway, that relationship collapsed. Lee performs something of a coup, gets control of Marvel as a publisher, isn't particularly interested in the day-to-day role itself, but likes being the figurehead, and I think the company appreciates that he's a decent brand ambassador, and he settles into that role. But Goodman is clearly bent on revenge, and himself and his son Chip form a rival company.
What a name, Chip.
Chip. I love Chip.
It's like it from an 80s movie.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So they come up with is it Chip the name of Christopher Walken's son in Batman Returns? Is it Chip? And he's a big man. He's a big lug of a man. Anyway, Goodman sets up Atlas Comics, which is a callback to a previous version of Marvel. And they start offering artists actual favorable rates and ownership of the property, the thing he never would have signed up to himself. And Lee blames him for that, the fact that he couldn't advocate on behalf of these artists and creators. But I think that's a bit dodgy myself. Anyway, so these artists have been tempted to go to Atlas because Martin Goodman's actually offering a decent deal for once. And Lee sends out this missive. Unfortunately, the fact that we're big, the fact that we're solidly financed, and the fact that we're ethically responsible actually acts against us. It's like Nazi Germany and the Allies in World War II. Hitler, being a dictator and having no one to answer to, could do as he wished whenever the mood struck him, and could make the most extravagant promises to his captive people, while being completely heedless to the consequences. The US, however, had to move slowly, following firmly established principles of law and government. Marvel, like the Allies, simply cannot counteract with impetuous pie-in-the-sky offers and promises. My God.
Yes, I am comparing my relative to Hitler.
To Hitler. Another Jewish man.
Yeah, they're Jewish, but...
And I'm America, which is so good and so ruled by law that we can't actually change things because we need to observe the rule of law. What's emerged from my readings on Stan Lee, never mind the taking advantage of creators, never mind the hogging of credit, all the rest of it, but what's emerged for me is a profound political centrism, and I would argue conservatism on his part, very reactionary conservatism as well. And Lee tends to get there's this bullpen he wrote where he talked about bigotry and how
Stan Soapbox,
the Stan Soapbox, sorry, where we need to fight against bigotry. We need to, it's not good, Marvel true believers, to be bigoted towards black people or people of different cultures and races and ethnicities and creeds and all the rest of it. He lays this out, and I still see that going viral on social media as the Stan Lee was, he was this progressive, total hogwash. And this weird little screed where he's comparing a competitor to the Nazis.
Yeah.
And explicitly because they're offering equitable rates. He's saying that's pie in the sky, that's fascism, that's Nazism, that's blaming an entire race group for all your problems, and then sending them to camps, and then you benefit as a result. That it's slavery, it's all these things. He's associating all this extreme reaction to a competitor. Amazing. But I think he shows himself there a bit, and particularly how he defines America, how he defines this idea of America, in contrast to Nazi Germany, being ethically responsible and moving slowly, which not true. By the way, not true. Yeah, because he doesn't want to pay a fair rate to Marvel creators. That's unbelievable.
Yeah, well, and that's also, I mean, the sort of contradiction of Lee, because on the one hand, he was, at least in his writing days, he was making freelance rates too. He was a freelancer too, but he ends up becoming more the voice of the company.
Yeah.
And he doesn't seem to have that much, well, either sympathy or even awareness of how the artists are feeling. When he decides that he wants to get some underground cartoonists together and make a book with Marvel that they call Comics Book, and he works with Dennis Kitchen, and he gives he realizes that these underground cartoonists are used to owning their work and so forth. So he gives in and lets them own the work that they put in this comics book. And then, as Dennis Kitchen says, he must have gotten a lot of angry feedback from the bullpen.
It was a revolt.
He says, I don't think he realized that there was this seething resentment among the Marvel creators about the way they were being treated. And now these underground guys were being treated the way all the other artists wanted to be treated too.
Yeah.
And it seems like it blindsides Stan.
My impression of Stan Lee, that particular passage as well, fascinating. I had no idea about comics. No. But that particular sequence, I suddenly realized Stan Lee is not this creative genius that he's credited with. He's not this writer monkey who just wants to get back to the great American novel. If it wasn't for these comics deadlines to keep forcing him to push out scripts, he's the office manager. He's the middle manager type who follows the company line and says he cares about his employees, but then just keeps forcing you to do incredible amounts of work to silly deadlines. I've met lots of Stan Lees in my time. I've met lots of these people who he suddenly realized there's all this resentment towards him. No. They knew, but he knew, but their jobs were dependent on them not saying anything, and he knew that. That's the bit. He knew that they were dependent on him. So he's surprised they spoke out because they're still so dependent on him. But he's then playing silly buggers because he's giving the underground cartoonists creative control of their own work. I found interesting that Crumb refused to go along with him, but I think there was some line to suggest that Crumb, I don't know which book I read this in, but there's some aside that Crumb saw him coming, basically. He was like, "I no, not you. Don't want to do with you."
And then there's also suggestion that it's possible that Stan tried to take too much credit later on as a way of staving off lawsuits from artists about ownership of the characters and stuff. That might have been part of his adherence to the company line.
Exactly. It kind of reminds me of the Joe Simon, Jack Kirby case, which actually, to Reisman's credit, he goes into a little bit more in his book what actually happened there with Kirby and Marvel, and where they offered him a deal to argue against Simon's creative control of Captain America. Sorry, but I wonder if and it's been suggested, particularly the amount of work Kirby was doing and Ditko was doing, all the rest of it. It's been suggested that, yes, having Stan Lee on side as creator is a legal bulwark against all the collaborators getting control and taking those characters and see, the real issue isn't making money from the comics. The real issue is the secondary rights. The real issue is the animation, is the merchandise, is the movies, is the events, the costumes, all those things.
Yeah, the Spider-Man bath towels.
There you go. That's where the money is. And so they're sitting on all these IP, and like Stan Lee is a useful fool almost for them in that respect. Um, there's, I think what we're seeing here is a sort of continuum of financial abuse. And it goes, and Stan Lee isn't at the top of it. He's at the midway point. It keeps going. You know, whoever owns the company, whoever the publisher is, whoever dictates. Like we certainly saw this recently with the movies, where the Disney buyout allowed the movie makers to have a little more creative freedom, because the owner of Marvel famously cheap, and didn't allow them to actually do things, and didn't allow them to maybe pursue certain storylines because he objected to it. But Disney has given them a little more leeway now, a little more opportunity. And say what you will about the formulaic nature of Marvel superhero movies, but there's a certain point where you can see things changed. You know, there's been an evolution, a lessening of the control.
Coming up, Stan's commercial innovation, the collapse of Stan Lee Media, why Stan's Hollywood efforts were unsuccessful, and more. Plus, my chat with co-author of Stan Lee and the Rise and Fall of the American Comic Book, Jordan Raphael. Unlock classic early episodes of Deconstructing Comics and get access to hours of additional podcasts about MCU movies and the early Amazing Spider-Man issues by Lee and Ditko. Support this podcast and our other shows at patreon.com/deconcomics. Or you can send a one-time donation via PayPal to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We appreciate your support.
You like cheap comic books, right? Well, I'm Professor Allen, and I talk about cheap comic books on the Quarterbin podcast. In every episode, I'll dissect a single comic from my collection, as long as I paid no more than 25 cents for the issue. Forget about $4 new comics that you can read in 4 minutes, or crossover events that can cost $100 to collect. Join me in the Quarterbin, where even bad comics are a bargain, and good ones are a steal. The Quarterbin podcast is part of the Relatively Geeky Podcast Network. Visit us at relativelygeekypodcast.blogspot.com or search Relatively Geeky or Quarterbin Podcast in iTunes. I guarantee it'll be worth every penny.
I was really interested in mention of Sally Kempton's article in the Village Voice, the super anti-hero in Forest Hills. And this is I think this is the first validation of Stan in popular print media. And I was surprised I haven't heard of this article before. Again, I'm surprised I haven't heard of Sally Kempton. The article is mentioned in the Reisman book, but Sally Kempton is not mentioned. And given how much gender has become a fraught issue in comics fandom, I would just like to credit Sally Kempton, a woman journalist, for actually, I would argue, kickstarting the Marvel moment by actually giving some column inches to Stan Lee and creating, I think, putting the first brick in this narrative around him as being this creative genius, and this notion of neurotic superheroes and psychologically complex superheroes. I think we can credit Sally Kempton with that.
You know, I was kind of struck by how much the portrayal of this book of particularly Stan and Jack reminded me of Lennon and McCartney.
Yes.
Where, they edit each other, and it's so, what the end product is so good because of how the two kind of control each other's worst impulses. Because Stan, I mean, there are numerous examples of later Stan ideas that never got made, and it's a good thing they didn't, because they were terrible. When you mentioned the mob takes over the government one. There was this one where a guy, I don't know, he's Rip Van Winkle or something, and he comes back and he finds, or he goes to the future, and he finds this world where there's no war, but everybody's miserable, and so he has to bring back war. Like, what?
Yeah.
What? How is that going to make people happier? But I mean, I guess I've never read any of Kirby's DC work, or his later Marvel work when he came back to Marvel. But apparently, it was not as good as what he did with Stan. So both of them were, not as good separately as they were together.
I think with Kirby, you can see, particularly the DC stuff. So I'm thinking of New Gods, etc. You can see somebody who doesn't have that finesse of the popular voice anymore, with Stan Lee not being part of it. But the creative fusion of ideas is incredible. Like his imagination is incredible, and I think that's his main appeal, is just the ability to sit down and dream up these modern mythologies. And I know that phrase gets thrown around a lot, somewhat willy-nilly. I think it only really applies to Jack Kirby. And I think a lot of folks have... I just sat through the 4-hour edit of the Justice League movie directed by Zack Snyder, which uses a lot of Kirby concepts in it. And they're stripped of any humanity that those characters had. And I know I'm talking about gods, evil gods at that, like Desaad and Darkseid and Steppenwolf. But Desaad was camp. He's like this sniving little creep. He's like the sort of the Nazi lickspittle who sucks up to High Commander, and you let's torture them, my lord. That's who Desaad is, and he looks like a sort of how you imagine Richard III to look, almost, this hunchback figure. And in the movie, he's this giant CGI effect with a face like a wrinkled mushroom. Whatever camp, fun, warm quality that Kirby's art and writing gave to him is gone. And Darkseid is like a fascinating character, because I think Darkseid is all about power and the abuse of power, but it's not force, it's not violence necessarily. It can be, but a lot of it is paranoia, suspicion, fear, the voice in your head that prevents you from helping somebody in trouble. That's what Kirby was interested in. He was interested in how ordinary people will allow horrible things to happen, inhumanity to happen. That's what Darkseid is. And in this movie, again, he's like a feckin' tank. He comes running, he punches gods out, he's like running around with his giant axe, and he's doing all these things that misses the point. He's a thug. And Kirby doesn't get enough credit for how much of a sense he had of the moment he was living through. And I think what Stan Lee did in creating this idea of a shared universe bit Kirby in the ass when he went to DC, because then all of a sudden this mythology he'd created from whole cloth for DC, I think he'd been working on it for Marvel already, he suddenly had to fit that into this world, right? So you can't have Darkseid and Highfather and Orion and Mr. Miracle and Caliban and all these characters. You also have to have Superman and Batman. Like all these, they need to coexist within this universe because of the shared universe concept that Stan Lee introduced, which has now been used in the movies so much, slavishly used across different movie studios, trying to recreate this idea of a shared universe. What is the shared universe? It's seen as this amazing innovation on the part of Stan Lee, but the innovation is the commercial impulse to have to buy everything to understand what the story is about. That's the shared universe. It's not...
and to get together a team book so that fans of each character will buy it, and but DC was doing that earlier with Justice League. That was another thing that Marvel was trying to imitate.
Yes, but this goes further. This turns into like crossovers, and events,
and eventually we get Secret Wars.
Yeah, or you'll have Spider-Man walking down the street, and then Human Torch will fly overhead, and Spider-Man will go, "Oh, what's he doing?" And then you'll be catching up. Read Fantastic Four issue 25 to find out what Johnny Storm's doing.
Right.
This idea of this continuing story, which is exciting for the reader. And I remember being a child and picking up some Marvel crossover in the early 90s, and there was a very similar moment where Johnny Storm sees Psylocke from the X-Men, and she's, "Oh wow, there's Psylocke, she's hot. Oh no, I don't think I'd have a chance with her." But Psylocke's a psychic, so she heard him. She's like, "Oh Johnny, you maybe should have had a go. Who knows what could have happened." So even in the 90s, they were still doing this thing Stan Lee was doing, where you had these passing characters to give us a sense of this continuing narrative. But it's not artistic. It's commercial. That's my point. And I feel Kirby didn't have that capitalist thrust to his imagination. He was genuinely trying to create stories. He was trying to make money. He was trying to provide for his family. But I don't think he had that emphasis on what would sell above all else that Lee definitely possessed.
Yeah. Did you ever look at the Stan Lee Media site back in like 2000 when it existed?
I have a feeling. I think it didn't pass the smell test for me.
Yeah, I remember looking at it and thinking, boy, this is average.
Yeah. I think I remember as well. I think I was plugged into lots of periodicals at the time. I was reading SFX magazine a lot at the time, I remember, which is a UK science fiction fantasy magazine. And I think they gave it a pretty sort of PR release write-up. And I remember reading it and saying, "Oh, a human being didn't write this. This is being written by some sort of algorithm before social media existed." I was like, "Oh, this is not something natural." So, are we going to talk about Mr. Pole?
Yeah,
This is an example of that. The man behind the man, the guy behind Stan Lee Media. Here's a quote from Mr. Pole. "Our role is to enable the utilization of a convergent team of multidisciplinary media talents to be focused on any appropriate activity to integrate the best aspects of the internet with offline activities to create a holistic approach to certain strategic objectives." Incredible.
No one knows what that means. Maybe not even him.
I think, he's saying we're going to create some websites that'll promote some comic books.
Yeah, what's his first name?
I want to say Peter Pole, but I could be wrong. Let me just confirm. Peter Pole.
It is Peter Pole.
F. Okay. Pole. Yes. I think as we continue with this series, we'll be talking about Mr. Peter Pole quite a lot.
Okay.
And his role in Stan Lee's life, latter half of his life.
But yeah, I mean, he had a criminal record before he went in with Stan on Stan Lee Media, and he continued criminal activities behind the scenes. And Raphael and Spurgeon observed that it was kind of a hard lesson for Stan to learn at such an advanced age. He's already in his 60s there, and he's taken in by Paul.
Is he though?
Or maybe he's just looking the other way. I don't know. He doesn't seem to have actually been involved in the crime, but
and again, we don't know really. I mean, there's lots of theories on that, but Paul's early criminal career got passed off. What was it? The Cuban coffee caper. His early criminal activity. He spun it into. Actually, I was a CIA operative. And, I was an anti-Castro agent, and what I find fascinating about that is, and again, talking about Stan Lee as a political minded person. He's associating with somebody who's proudly advertising his efforts to interfere with democratic countries in South America. He's somebody who associates with people who boast about executing Allende. Like he's somebody who is a Reagan era freedom fighter. That's how he would term himself. And again, and I'm not American, so I can't speak to this. Maybe you can help me along here. But there seems to be this double side nature with certain personalities, particularly the political right, where it's like, okay, when we do terrorism, it's not terrorism. When we do terrorism, it's freedom. We're fighting for freedom. And this was somebody who Stan Lee went into business with, who seems very proud of that, and seems to be of the mind that he did what he needed to do. Whether that's true or not is another question again, because it could all be a story. But certainly, what I'm saying is these people. This was the sense of themselves that they put out into the world, and this was the kind of person and his associates that Stan Lee decided, I want to work with this person. Another nail in the coffin for Stan Lee, progressive champion of 1960s radicalism. Stan Lee, whose main contributor to the race debate in America seems to be try not to make a fuss.
Well, we're coming up on an hour here, but I do want to touch on another thing here, which is, in the 80s and into the 90s, Stan is in Hollywood trying to get Marvel stuff made, and it's striking how unsuccessful he is.
He's very bad at it.
I mean, they get some cartoons made, and they get some movies made, but they're mostly crap. I think the Captain America movie of the early 90s is called Unwatchable in this book. And I'm just wondering why nothing seemed to work out. Well, the Hulk TV show was okay, but it didn't really adhere to the comics very closely. The 70s Spider-Man show, I don't know, as a 13-year-old, I guess I thought it was better than nothing, but only barely. And yeah, I mean, I'm trying to figure out if, how much of that failure was Stan, how much of it was that he was, pretty old by Hollywood standards, how much of it was just that the technology was not there to do a convincing Spider-Man movie. I don't know. What do you think? Why was he so unsuccessful at that?
He was completely unsuited for it. He had no ability to sell these concepts. And I think as well, we've, in our minds, and a mention is made that some of the people he interacted with in Hollywood were huge fans of Stan Lee because they grew up with Marvel comics. But in our minds, he's this sort of creative giant, because Stan Lee Presents is at the beginning of every comic book. But from Stan Lee's perspective, that's all rubbish. Like, he doesn't want to be a comic creator, he doesn't want to be associated with comics, he wants to be associated with films, he wants to be associated with novels, literature, whatever, poetry, he wants to write poems. And when you put him in Hollywood, he's way down the totem pole. He has no cachet. He has no capital. He's got nothing to bring to the table. And he's taking meetings with whoever he can take meetings with.
Well, apparently people enjoy meeting with him because of his personality, but he can't seem to talk anybody into making anything.
And what are the commercial prospects of the works he's trying to sell them? They see them purely as maybe at best a cartoon that they might have seen with their kid watching, or a comic book, and they can't envision it, and he can't lead them along to envision the sense of spectacle, like what Spider-Man could be on the big screen, what the X-Men could be on the big screen. And also, I think the other fact of the matter is he wasn't reading the comics, so he doesn't have a passion for them really. I think that's the bit of the story I'm interested in most. Like, here's this guy, he's taking these meetings, he's trying to sell these ideas, but he doesn't really care about them. He cares that they they launched him. I think. I hope I'm not being unfair here, but I think that's true. I think he cares that they gave him access to a public persona and a public audience, but he doesn't seem to know why other people liked them.
Well, I wonder if there's an element of him being too close to the subject because he was involved in the creation of these characters, and maybe he feels like the appeal is obvious and he doesn't need to explain it.
But then because he doesn't read them, so he doesn't know what the current teams are doing. He doesn't know the current creators are, or the current characters are. Like, I mean, X-Men, I think.
Well, and he's
no connection with that,
and he's out of touch with
completely
the changes in the market too.
Yeah,
where he's insisting in 1978 that the readers are still mainly 12-year-olds, and he's speaking to a room full of adults at a comic convention.
Yeah, and again, as you've pointed out with the references to his strange little nuggets of ideas, he's a man of his time. He was born in the 1920s, and he's now pitching ideas in the 80s and 90s to studio people who are probably a good 20 years younger than him, and are maybe more plugged into what's selling right now. We need to recall as well the market, the Hollywood market for action heroes that existed in the 1980s and 1990s. You're talking about bare-chested, muscle-bound men in the Schwarzenegger model, or maybe slightly more vulnerable, but still quite fit, guys like Bruce Willis in the Die Hard model. And then you show them something like Captain America, and they just can't see, they can't visualize it. Right? It's no surprise to me that Punisher actually did sell. But
that was a little bit more of an 80s-ish concept that probably could have worked if it would done better.
Yeah, but it was a slapdash effort as well, because unfortunately the people who took the meeting were, again, themselves further down the totem pole. I don't think he was able to interact with Hollywood, but he enjoyed being there. And he enjoyed meeting the people and being photographed with the celebrities and going to the dinners and all that stuff. And I think what Peter Paul gave him was more leverage in those spaces, because Peter Paul could walk the walk and talk to these people and create this sense of excitement over the creative genius of Stan Lee. But I don't think he could do it himself. So I think what we're learning is that Lee always needed a right-hand man. In comics, in Hollywood, in business, he needed somebody else. He couldn't be Stan Lee without support. And that's the sort of picture that starts to emerge when you look at the different points in his life. There's always somebody else in the equation. There's always someone else there, some other creative engine or face man, somebody who can represent him, pushing along his efforts.
Okay, well, we could talk about this forever, I think, but so we'll. Would you recommend this book?
I would strongly recommend this book. I think Spurgeon and Raphael did a really good job. There's lots of, as you said at the very start of the conversation, it's quite even-handed, it's quite fair. There's lots of little factoids they dig up. Like I mentioned, the journalist Sally Kempton, I found that quite interesting. I want to read more about her and her role. Little things like Bruce Banner was called David Banner in the Incredible Hulk TV series because Bruce was considered too homosexual a name.
Yeah.
Amazing anecdote. Gives you a sense of who Stan Lee's having to interact with in Hollywood. Like if that's the kind of notes he's getting, you do get a sense of how strained it was. And I think they did a fantastic job. There's a quick little, another little quote I just want to throw in. This is Spurgeon again. Suddenly Johnny, the teenage brother of Susan, bursts into flame and, in ejaculatory fashion, fires himself off the ground and into flight. And I just wrote beside it, pardon? It's a very warmly written book, but it's a factual and it's balanced and it's I think it's a good grounding in the life of this person who I think was more idea than man when we first met him. And as he aged, and the unfortunate end of his life, I think it all just got taken away, and he became an old man who I think was very lonely towards the end.
Yeah. I think it is a good look at his good points and bad points. I did kind of wish that it had been updated to include, the MCU era. As this book is ending, there have finally been some film successes which were not brought about by Stan. Avi Arad got the X-Men movies made and Spider-Man with Tobey Maguire. Stan didn't accomplish that, but those have been made and they were successful, and Stan did cameos. I wonder how this book would have been different if it had been, updated around the time of Stan's death.
Yes, well, you've got the Reisman book to look forward to, which does dip into that a lot. And one of the things I enjoyed was the accounts of Stan Lee's behavior on set and his approach to acting. Okay, so I'll leave that to you to enjoy.
Yeah, well, I can kind of guess what it might say, but we'll see when we get to that one. Okay, cool. All right, I'm talking to Jordan Raphael, who's in Los Angeles. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Okay. Yeah, so Emmet and I had just reviewed the book that you wrote with Tom Spurgeon back in the early 2000s about Stan Lee. How did that collaboration with Tom come about?
So back in the 1990s, I was an intern at the Comics Journal, and Tom at the time was one of the editors. I believe he was managing editor at the time. I later became a more junior editor working for Tom there. And during that time, we became pretty close, and in subsequent years, stayed in touch. I later moved to Los Angeles, did a couple things, became a journalist, and in the course of that, wrote some articles for various publications. And one of those articles was a profile that I wrote about Stan Lee for the LA Times Magazine that came out in 2000. And in the course of writing that article, I was in touch with Tom, and we were talking about different things that we might want to do together. And one of the things that we realized at the time was that no one had ever really written a serious journalistic work about Stan and what he had done and the whole history with him and his co-creators on the various Marvel projects from the early years. And so we put together a book proposal through a book agent that Tom was in touch with at the time. And that agent was fortunate enough to sell it, and that became the book.
Okay. Yeah, and I noticed you linked me to that article, and I noticed that was some material that got used in the book too, where Stan is meeting with the RZA.
Correct. Yeah, I remember that. That was during one of the interviews I had of Stan at that time, and he was involved. I believe it was POW Entertainment. They were doing a lot of different online animation projects, and
that was
there was
Stanley Media. Yeah.
Oh, was that Stanley? Oh, it was pre-POW. Sorry, correct.
Yeah, I think POW happened after the book came out. Maybe
POW came out.
There's no POW
exactly.
in the book.
Good, correct. Sorry.
Yeah,
it's been a long time.
But when I was reading the book, I was like, wow, it sounds like they were in the room when all this was happening. So now I know why that was.
When you met the RZA, you mean?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I was in the room when that was happening. That's exactly right.
Okay. So what was your approach to writing with Tom? Like, did you take different sections, or how did you do that?
It's a good question, actually. I actually think about that a lot, and I'll tell you the reason. So what we did is we basically broke the book out into chapters, and each chapter was going to cover a different time period in Stan's life, and with that time period, different subject matter. For example, early 1960s, the creation of some of those key Marvel titles. And then I was assigned half of them. Tom was assigned half of them. And then we would then edit each other's sections, add in things, do additional research that might be needed. But the interesting thing now is when I look back at the book, with a few exceptions, I can't tell who wrote which part. And Tom and I actually had conversations about that in later years, that even though at the time is very clear, over time, we've since been unable to sort of differentiate who wrote which sections.
Well, I wonder, maybe that explains. So I had noticed that there are certain points, I think, I don't remember what they were now. I think the Badness of the Punisher movie was one, where those points are brought up twice within the book, but in a way like they're both being brought up for the first time.
Maybe we weren't as careful in the editing to recall that, oh yeah, I wrote about that part, and maybe we should take it out of your chapter. Some of the chapters at the end did come together in a bit of a hurry as we were rushing to meet the deadline. So it's definitely possible that we missed some parts like that. That's a good point. Good point.
Okay. Yeah, now I understand how that would happen. It was like, you talked about this before, and now you're bringing it up like you haven't talked about it before. So have you, we were talking before we started recording, have you read any of the Abraham Reisman book yet?
I haven't. I have it on my desk. And to prove it to you, I know this isn't a video recording, but I'll show it to you. Here it is.
Yeah, there it is.
I noticed that the acknowledgement mentioned Tom, which I thought was a very nice touch. And I read reviews of it, and I understand it's quite a good book, but I have not had a chance to read it yet because I have a 6-month-old, and she has kept me very occupied. Yeah. But the first chance I get, I'm going to read it. It's the first book on my pile, and I'm very excited, and I understand it's quite a good book from all the reviews I've read. I think there was a very good review in the New Yorker as well of it that I thought was what interested me in reading the book.
Yeah. Well, I noticed, so that book and your book both had the rise and fall bit in the title. There's like, I guess that yours are the only two Stan Lee books that have done that, but it just seemed like, oh, okay, there's a theme running through these.
Yeah, I mean, it's a trope. And with Abe's book, I think the rise and fall, his book spans a much longer time period than ours.
Yeah.
Because our book came out in 2003, so there's another 17 years or 16 years of Stan's life that came afterward. And there were a lot of personal issues that Stan had later in life with his daughter and various managers who were trying to take advantage of him. And Abe had done, at least I've read his articles that he'd written in other publications that I understand are in the book as well, detailing some of those. So I think that arc of Stan's life is covered as part of his book. And I know the articles I've read about it have been quite detailed and very quite good. And so I think he's got a lot more to the latter part of his life than obviously we did, since it came out 17 years ago.
So in terms of the authorship of Marvel stuff, how much credit do you think Stan should get? What did he actually do in terms of those characters?
Well, I can tell you that Tom obviously would have a much better answer than I'm going to give you, but I'll tell you my own perspective. Is basically, I've always viewed it as collaborations, and I think that the credit that's being given now in connection with the movies and TV shows, where they always mention the creation by a writer and an artist together, is the appropriate way to credit Stan and the artists that he worked with on those titles. I think earlier, back in the 60s and 70s, and even some of the early 80s, when some of the intellectual property issues were a lot more salient and there was more concern about whether or not some of those artists would come back and try to claim rights over these properties that even then were clearly quite valuable. I think there was some aligning of the credit for the artist and much more emphasis placed on Stan. But I don't think that changes the fact that as works, it's quite clear that the writer and the artist both had something close to an equal contribution to those works, at least in my view.
Yeah. Well, like I said to Emmett while we were in our review, it feels to me, especially with Kirby, like it was sort of the same type of thing as with Lennon and McCartney, where they each sort of, edited out the other's worst tendencies, and so you got a better product than you did when either one of them was working separately.
Oh, absolutely. And then when they're working separately, subsequent to that time period, when they put out all that amazing stuff together, it's clear that it's not as good. Mm-hmm. And it's clear from some of Kirby's later works that he needed an editor, someone to restrain his more bombastic impulses. And it's also clear that Stan didn't have the same artistic talent by his side. At least, some of obviously the Spider-Man stuff that came later was still pretty good, but definitely into the 80s and 90s. And then definitely when he was into the Stan Lee media phase and into the 2000s, wasn't really doing anything of real quality at that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember taking a look at the Stan Lee media site sometime in 2000. Like, boy, this is average.
Yeah, it wasn't very good, unfortunately. But, what are you going to do? Guys got to eat.
It's striking to me how much Stan wanted to be famous for writing novels and screenplays, and then when he had a chance, he just couldn't do it. Like, he couldn't focus on it, or he just didn't have good enough ideas sometimes. And he also didn't really succeed at getting good Marvel movies made. He got some bad ones made. But why do you think he failed at both of those things?
I think it's just that he was good at one particular thing. And it was that he was good at, putting in dialogue and some of the story conception and taking characters that he'd been discussing with other folks and just sort of enhancing them in this comic book medium. None of that work is really a sustained novelistic type work. It's not like a 21 or 24 page Spider-Man comic is the same thing as sitting down and writing a 350 page novel. And that was what his strength was. And he was really good in doing it with Kirby, and he was good in doing it with Ditko. And, they did a whole bunch of really cool sort of monster comics too in the 1950s before all that superhero stuff. They were really hitting their stride on those collaborations. And when it comes to writing, interesting novels, it's just not what he was good at. And that's fine. People have their strengths, and people have other things that they're not so good at. And then when it came to the movie properties, it's hard to know if that was really Stan's fault. It may be some of the folks who were guiding him into Hollywood. But you got to remember a couple things. Is that one, so the deals that they made weren't great, right? They tied up those Fantastic Four rights really poorly. The Spider-Man rights were not sold in any clean way, so they ended up in all sorts of fights. So it took years to untangle that. But they also didn't have the technology to make those movies. And even the stuff that they were making, they made the Hulk TV show, and then they'd make some of those TV movies, right? You remember they made those like 4 TV movies, or the Doctor Strange movie in like 1978.
Or the Nicholas Hammond Spider-Man.
Yeah. They just didn't have the technology to really do anything useful. So it just didn't, the era hadn't really come. And I think, if you're really being honest, like the first really good superhero movie, I think those Superman movies from the late 70s are pretty good, but really the 1989 Batman movie is the one that kind of shows the way, right? Is the one where you can actually do something interesting. And then that leads into, I guess, into the late 90s, then you start saying, all right, now we can make a good Spider-Man movie. So it takes time, but I don't know that it was necessarily his fault. That certainly didn't help that whoever was guiding in Hollywood was, not selling those rights in a clean way.
No.
And there weren't really any buyers either. That's part of the issue too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is there weren't a lot of big buyers, and that's why they were just selling them for cheap and making deals that, weren't advantageous to them ultimately.
Well, and maybe the big players knew that they didn't have the technology yet to make a good movie, but the little crappy studios said, oh, we can do this, and then...
Right. That's true. And if you think about the time, like, who was making those kinds of genre movies? It was small outfits that were making, right? It's the companies that were making Predator. It was the companies that were making, Terminator, right? Terminator wasn't made by like a huge studio, right? So,
okay. So, well, since this book came out, you've had a major career change. Tell us how that came about.
So I'm after the book came out, I went to law school and I became a lawyer. It came about because it was just pretty clear at the time that journalism wasn't headed in a good direction, and I decided to jump off the ship before it sank. No disrespect to all my former colleagues who are still doing it. I went to law school and became an attorney, and now I do intellectual property law in Los Angeles. And I have a small firm with a partner of mine, and we do copyright, trademark, some patent, just run-of-the-mill intellectual property cases.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. Okay, well, I don't have any other questions, but yeah, thanks a lot for coming on. It was good to get some background on the book.
Thank you, yeah.
Stan Lee and the Rise and Fall of the American Comic Book is published by Chicago Review Press. By the way, Emmet has a story in a comics anthology called Tales from Neverland that's currently running a Kickstarter campaign. And yes, the theme of the book is Peter Pan. I'll put the link in the show notes, so check it out and support it if you feel so inclined. Of course, you can also help Deconstructing Comics and all our podcasts by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/deconcomics. And go to deconstructingcomics.com to connect to us on Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, to shop on Amazon to support the show, and to find links to subscribe to the podcast. Our theme is by J.B. Anderton. Next week on Critiquing Comics, Adam Passion and I discuss Realm of Owls by Gerolf and Vyandil. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.